So much great information to talk about today, and we are welcoming one of my absolute favorite folks in the ALS space, Dr. Rick Bedlack. So today's webinar is alternative and off-label treatments that might reduce the risk of getting ALS. This is a topic that's super near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to have you all here with us today. So we are a genetic ALS and FTD and the Legacy. We're a community-led nonprofit affiliated with ALS Hope Foundation, and we are focused on providing education and support, resources to, promoting research about, and advocating for our community. Just as a quick reminder, we do have our second annual community summit coming up for those who are impacted by genetic ALS and FTD in Philadelphia, PA. So we will be joining the East Coast this time, and that is just around the corner, Friday, June 6th to Sunday, June 8th. Hop on over to our website to learn more. We would love to welcome you to that event, where we're going to have a bunch of really cool things, just like today's webinar. So without too much further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Rick Bedlack. I have a deep personal connection to him. He was my uncle's doctor, and anytime I sent a frantic email, I swear less than 5 minutes, and I would get this beautiful reply back. He is such a friend to the ALS community. Dr. Bedlack grew up in Connecticut, and then went to college at William and Mary in Virginia, then back to Connecticut for not only an MD, but also a PhD in neuroscience at UConn. And now he's at Duke, where my uncle met him. He did his Medicine Internship, Neurology Residency, Neuromuscular Fellowship, and Master's in Clinical Research there. He is currently Stewart, Hughes, and Wendt Distinguished Professor of ALS at Duke and Director of the Duke ALS Program. He has won awards for teaching and patient care, including Best Neurology Teacher at Duke, as well as Healthcare Hero, Strength, Hope, and Caring Award, America's Best Doctor, the American Academy of Neurology Patient Advocate of the Year, the Rasmussen ALS Patient Advocate of the Year, Forbes-Norris Award, and Hop on a Cure AMP Award. He has received ALS research grants, participated in clinical trials, and published more than 160 ALS articles. He's the leader of the International ALSUntangled program, which uses social networking to investigate alternative and off-label treatment options for patients with ALS. And he leads up the ALS Reversals program, which tries to figure out how some patients with ALS recover and to make this happen more often, which is my favorite part. He lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife, Shelly, 2 mischievous cats, and a whole bunch of really awesome blazers. And I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Bedlack.
That's so kind of you, Cassandra. Let me see if I can get my slides to come up again. Yeah, there we go. Can you see them okay? Good. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in today. This topic is a new one for me, but it's really kind of a spin-off of something that I've been working on for the past 16 years now, which is ALS Untangled. And Cassandra and Jean and some of my own patients and families have asked, do you ever run into anything in that program for people that have a genetic mutation that is thought to cause ALS, but don't actually have ALS yet? We call that elevated risk of genetic ALS. And it turns out, yes, we have run into a few things, which we'll talk about today. So again, the hypothesis is that there might actually be things out there that people at elevated risk of genetic ALS, those carrying a pathogenic gene variant, could do to try to prevent or delay the onset of their disease. So this is not about treating ALS itself. We've given a lot of other webinars in the last 25 years about that topic. This is something completely new. And the way that I'll go through this today is I'll tell you a little bit about the wonderful prior work that's been done, really led by Jean and Cassandra and Michael Benatar. I'll tell you where I got the ideas for this talk. I'll highlight some cautions, and then we'll go through some specific alternative and off-label treatment ideas. So there'll be 2 diets. There's 1 supplement I'll talk about, and there's 1 prescription drug. And then something that I've been asked to do many times is just sort of be honest about what I think I might do if I was in that situation. So very often I get asked, if you had ALS, what would you do? And so here I'm asking the question, if I had one of these pathogenic gene variants but didn't have ALS yet, what would I do? And then finally, I'm going to make some suggestions for the next workshop or guidance that this community does on this topic. All right, so let's talk about some prior work. So again, a lot of this work has been going on for years, led by my brilliant colleague from Miami, Michael Benatar. And so he's had this idea that there is a pre-symptomatic phase of ALS. And he's actually sort of outlined 3 parts to it. The first part is what's going on clinically. And so clinically, he feels like there's some non-specific symptoms that patients with these pathogenic gene variants have before they blossom into full-blown ALS. These could be twitching, these could be fatigue, anything except like overt weakness, atrophy, hyperreflexia, which are the signs of full-blown ALS. But even before that, he thinks that there is this phase where axons start to deteriorate. So axons are the long processes that motor neurons have. And as they start to fall apart, even before someone has symptoms, there can be a change in something in the blood and spinal fluid called neurofilament. This is a chemical that's released from any kind of neuron that's sick and dying. And then he's gone one step further, and he's hypothesized that there could actually be something even before that, even before the axons start to deteriorate and that chemical starts to rise and people develop these nonspecific symptoms. There could actually be other biomarkers that start to become abnormal that tell us about pathways like inflammation or oxidative stress. Now, in his pre-symptomatic familial ALS studies, he actually has evidence for the neurofilament spike before any clinical signs. And he has evidence for this prodromal phase, this period where people have nonspecific things that they complain about, but doesn't yet really have evidence for these novel biomarkers. I think he's still kind of looking for something there. And so with all the work that he did, he pulled together stakeholders from across the whole community, including many people living with these pathogenic variants. And there was a workshop that was held last year. And sort of the way that it worked was surveys were sent out, and people who attended the workshop were asked questions like, what are your thoughts about genetic counseling for people who come from families where there's an ALS gene? What are your thoughts about clinical monitoring? And then the one that was most near and dear to me, what are your thoughts about interventions? And that's really what the topic of our talk is. So, he started by asking, there's FDA-approved therapies for full-blown ALS, like riluzole and edaravone and tofersen. Is anybody actually using those in any of these pre-symptomatic phases of ALS? And it seemed like the consensus was no, that most people were withholding those until people developed clear symptoms and signs of ALS. And then there were also some thoughts about lifestyle and environmental exposure recommendations. And the only one really that pertained to diet was this. In the paper that he wrote about that workshop, he sort of summarized some literature on something called omega-3 and alpha-linoleic acid. And the recommendation was to ensure an adequate intake of omega-3 and alpha-linoleic acid. So, it's pretty vague. We'll get into some more specifics there, but there really weren't any clear recommendations on caffeine or selenium, statins, which was asked. I think the recommendation there was if you need them, use them. Smoking, he thought probably people should avoid smoking. There is some evidence that could be a risk factor for ALS, but also there's many other health problems that go along with smoking. Head injury, recommendation was to minimize head injury. And then there was also a recommendation to try to minimize exposures to fertilizers, pesticides, and lead. But again, these are sort of like very high level, not really like specific steps that people can take. And so let me tell you where I got the ideas that I'm going to present to you today. They came from this program that was mentioned by Cassandra earlier that I've been working on since 2009. It's called ALS Untangled. And the reason I started this was I just noticed that many of my patients were coming into clinic with bags of stuff, supplements mostly, that they purchased on the internet. And in fact, back then, those weren't even getting entered into the medical record. Like it was just sort of push those off to the side and let's put the medications in the record. And it just occurred to me, like, if so many patients are interested in these things, shouldn't I be interested? I mean, shouldn't I use my years of training and knowledge to help them make more informed decisions about the things they buy and try? And wouldn't I want to be monitoring them if they're taking something new to see if it's harmful or if it's helpful? So there was never a program like this. And to this day, there still isn't, that I've ever been able to find in any disease. So we kind of had to invent it on the fly. And there's three parts to it. The first part is where we get our ideas. The second part is how we review those ideas. And the third part is how we get the information back to people living with ALS. And so ideas can come in a variety of ways. So one of my colleagues could be asked in clinic by one of their patients, what do you think about this? And if they don't know about it, they'll send an email to me and say, put it on the list. My email is all over the internet. So I get a lot of emails every day about people who've noticed new things and want to know what our opinion is. And so when a new idea comes in, we put it on a page called the Future Reviews page of our website, www.alsuntangled.org. I never imagined we would get this many ideas. We have well over 500 ideas that we haven't written about yet. That's more ideas than I will ever live to be able to review. So we've had to prioritize these. And the main way we prioritize them is we let people vote. So if you see something on there that you're really interested in, like let's say you were really interested in ozone, well, you click the button next to ozone and it moves up on the list. Now, we try to prioritize our reviews by the ones that have the most votes, but we have noticed that some things that people want to know about, there just isn't any useful disclosable information. So there are new clinics that pop up all the time. And when somebody asks about one, the first thing that we try to do is scour the website. Some of the clinics don't have a website. The next thing we try to do is we try to contact the person who's running the clinic and get them to talk to us and maybe answer some basic questions, maybe even let us come visit. But if that step fails, if they don't respond to us, or as has happened on several occasions, they say, if you write one word about us, we're going to sue you. Well, there's nothing really to say. I mean, we don't know anything about what they're doing there. So we have a multiplier, and the votes get multiplied by 0 if we can't get any useful disclosable information. Now, we'll keep looking. And if at some point some information becomes public, then we'll change the multiplier to 1. And if there are things that actually have a clinical trial or a case series, the multiplier will be 2, because that's where we get the most information. So we try to make our reviews as objective as possible. So it's not just my opinion about all these things. We have a team, and the team has really grown. There's 130 clinicians and scientists now working together on this from across 11 different countries. And we've invented something that we call standard operating procedures. These guide everything we do, from how we gather information, how we write the review, how we crowdsource it, and ultimately publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. And all of these SOPs revolve around something that we invented called the table of evidence. So for each idea, we're trying to find out 5 things about it. What's the mechanism? How is this supposed to work? And does that make any sense as far as what we know about the biology of ALS? What kind of preclinical models has this thing been tested in? Has it ever been in a cell model of ALS or an animal model of ALS? And if so, what happened? Case reports. Who can we find that's actually tried this? And what are they saying about it? And can we prove that that's a real person? Can we get their medical records and prove that they have ALS, and prove, if they're describing benefits, prove that those benefits are real, that they're objectively confirmed by some measurements in the chart? Trials, and then finally risks. What kind of bad things could happen to a person who tries this, and how likely are those to happen? Now, this table of evidence is not exactly appropriate for the topic that we're going to take on today. So first of all, we don't know what an appropriate mechanism would be for something that prevents ALS, because we don't really know what the first stages of ALS are. As I mentioned, Dr. Benatar and his team are trying to find those biomarkers, but we don't know. We don't have them yet. We also don't know, like, what kind of preclinical model might be relevant. There's a tendency to believe that, well, a mouse model where there's an SOD1 mutation should be applicable to people with SOD1 mutations. Maybe. I mean, the fact is, there's only one medicine really that's translated from the mouse to people, and that's tofersen. If we keep getting hits like that, then I think we'll gain confidence. But for right now, I would say that we just don't know for sure. There's not really going to be any case reports or trials that can help us, again, because we wouldn't have a control for the case reports. And as far as trials, the only trial that's ever tried to prevent ALS is the ATLAS trial that's going on right now. And I don't know of any publicly available results. But of course, the risks category is helpful. So I'll always tell you what I think the risks might be to someone who tries one of these things that I'm going to mention. So just in case you're curious, if you're someone who already has ALS, you might want to actually read some of the reviews, the final reviews. So, once we get a draft, we send it around to the team, everybody comments, we incorporate those comments, we send it into the journal, ALS and frontal temporal degeneration. It gets an independent peer review. And then I have to respond to that peer review. And then it finally gets published. And all of our reviews are published through something called free open access. We have an agreement that patients will never be charged to read these reviews. If you don't want to read a whole review, you can look and see what the table of evidence grades are on the completed review section of our website. Also, we've learned that sometimes people don't want to read a lot of information. They want to listen, maybe in their car or while they're exercising. And so podcasts have become very popular. And so we've partnered with a group, the CREATE Consortium, again, Michael's group at University of Miami. And a person who has lived with ALS interviews me about each one of these topics and asks questions that a non-scientist might have about the review. And those are typically around 10 minutes long. And then the last thing is we've learned that people all over the world want this information. It's not unique to just English-speaking people. So we've got some volunteers that speak Spanish and some that speak Italian, and they're helping us translate some of these reviews and podcasts into other languages. So let me just throw out a couple of cautions here, and I think these might be the two most important slides of the day. The first is that none of these ideas that I talk about today have been proven in a clinical trial to delay or prevent ALS. There aren't any clinical trials. As I mentioned, the only one that has ever happened in history is the ATLAS trial, and it's ongoing. So where did this information come from then? Why would we think that some of these things could possibly delay or prevent ALS? Well, there's three types of studies out there that we've run into. The first is called the case control study. So what happens there is you start with a small number of people who have ALS, maybe people in somebody's clinic, and then you match them. You usually match them as far as age range, demographics, race, ethnicity, maybe geography, and you look backward over the lives of the people with ALS and the matched controls. And you ask the question, is there any difference in exposures over the lives of these patients? It sounds good. The problem is there's a lot of biases. Like the first bias is you're asking people to remember. So let's say that we hypothesize that vitamin B12 could prevent ALS. Well, we'd ask people, well, tell me 10 years ago, were you taking B12? What was your dose? And, you never can be quite sure that people remember exactly the right things. There can be biases. For example, people with a terrible condition like ALS may be more likely to really rack their brain and think about exposures that could have triggered their ALS, as opposed to people who don't have any diseases, who aren't that concerned about those kinds of things. It's not even really possible with case control studies to be sure that the exposure happened before the onset of the disease. Again, because you're relying on people's memory. So a much better type of study is called a cohort study. This is where you start with a huge number of people without ALS, usually healthy people who decided to sign up for something. Could be a cohort, for example, of military veterans, or a cohort of people that had cancer in their family. And these are typically hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people that you follow forward, usually for decades. And you look to see what kind of diseases does this group of people get. And usually there's some sort of measurements made along the way, including questionnaires that are more reliable in terms of exposures that people might have. The downside of these is that they're very expensive and they take a long time, decades. And then there's one more type of study that we're going to mention. It's called a nested case control. So this is a type of study where there's a cohort study that's going on and somebody's interested in a subset of the cohort. And so they might look in a cohort study and say, I'm just interested in people who developed ALS who also have 10 blood samples done over the past 40 years. And so that's where you get your cases, you match them again to a control group, and you look backward over the first part of the cohort study. So it's kind of somewhere in between as far as pros and cons. It's definitely much better than a traditional case control study, but not as good as a total cohort study. So one of the biggest problems with this topic is when you're looking at a large population like that of 1 million or more people, there's no way to know how many of them might have had a pathogenic gene variant that put them at an elevated risk of ALS. You know, when these cohorts started, oftentimes back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we didn't really have widespread genetic testing. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to interpret those and give you some ideas, but none of these ideas are FDA approved for preventing or delaying ALS. And then finally, and most importantly, please do not take what I say today as specific medical advice. That can only be provided by your doctor. I'm here to provide education, ideas that you can then take to your own doctor and get medical advice. All right, so let's talk about some of the specific things. So first, we did bump into these polyunsaturated fatty acids that Dr. Benatar talked about in his summary of his first workshop with a couple of different ALS Untangled reviews. You'll hear me refer to these as PUFAs. These are essential nutrients. Essential means we can't make them. We have to get them from our diet. And they do a lot of really good things for our bodies. So they're really important beyond any question of ALS. So they're important for brain function, cell growth, cell membrane structure, and they can also be antioxidant and anti-inflammatory, which is part of how we ran into them with our ALS Untangled reviews. These fall into two groups, omega-3 PUFAs. And so examples there would include something called alpha linoleic acid, or ALA. And also, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that one, icosapentaoic acid, EPA, and docahexanoic acid, DHA. Terrible names. And then the other category is omega-6. And these include linoleic acid, so just LA, and arachidonic acid. So of all these different PUFAs, the one that's going to emerge as being probably most important, both in ALS and maybe in pre-symptomatic ALS, is the alpha linoleic acid. And where does this come from specifically? You can find it in flaxseed, walnuts, chia seeds, vegetable oils, red meats, and dairy products. So we do have a couple of case control studies suggesting an association between diets that have a lot of PUFAs in them and a lower ALS risk. Again, these are not the ideal type of study, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on them because we have better studies. Specifically, we have one very large prospective cohort study. And this study actually pooled 5 different cohort studies. So altogether, they followed 1 million people, and they followed them for decades, in some cases 40 years. And over time, 1,000 cases of ALS eventually emerged from these cohorts. And the nice thing is that diets were being assessed by questionnaires all the way through these long cohort studies. And it was pretty clear from this pooled cohort that diets with a high omega-3 content, specifically at least 2.11 grams per day, had about a 38% lower risk of developing ALS. And most of that came from alpha linoleic acid, ALA. So specifically, folks who had a lot of that in their diet, at least 1.93 grams per day, had a 27% lower risk of developing ALS. So there is also one nested case control study. So within that big cohort study that I just told you about, one group went back and focused only on people who had eventually developed ALS and also had serial blood draws. So this turned out to be 300,000 people with serial blood draws, of which 275 developed ALS. And on those blood draws, they looked at the blood level of PUFAs. And it was clear that folks who had a higher blood level of alpha linoleic acid had about a 37% lower risk of developing ALS. Now, most of this was in men. In fact, the risk in men was 80% lower. Now, the one downside of this was they used a comparison of high versus low, but they didn't actually give us cutoffs for what the levels were, which makes it hard to try to shoot for a specific level of alpha-linoleic acid. What do we know about the risks of alpha-linoleic acid? Well, it's pretty safe. I mean, excessive amounts of it might cause some risks. Like it looks like people who have a tendency toward prostate cancer might be more likely to have that emerge or get worse. It looks like people who are on medicines that make their blood thinner, like somebody who's on an antiplatelet therapy for their heart or for a stroke, or somebody who's on anticoagulation for a blood clot, probably shouldn't try to shoot for a high level of this. And then finally, if you have a kidney transplant, this might not be a good idea either, because there's a study suggesting that you're more likely to die sooner after a kidney transplant. But that's not most people. So the other dietary intervention of interest is carotenoids. So what's a carotenoid? Carotenoids are chemicals that give fruits and vegetables their bright colors. They're found not only in plants, but also algae, some bacteria, funguses, animals, like, for example, salmon. There's a carotenoid that gives salmon their bright pink color. And again, these can be antioxidant. They can be anti-inflammatory. They can boost mitochondrial function. They can even impair a process by which motor neurons kill themselves in ALS called apoptosis. So these are some promising products when it comes to the treatment of ALS. There's over 700 types of carotenoids. So some common ones that you'll hear about are beta-carotene, which is found in carrots, lutein, which is found in spinach, and astaxanthin, which is found in salmon. And so again, we have a couple of case control studies suggesting an association between diets that are high in carotenoids and lower risk of ALS, but we won't spend time on that type of study. We'll focus on this large prospective cohort study. So this is another one that pooled multiple cohorts. They were not exactly the same cohorts as the previous study I told you about, but again, they had more than 1 million participants in these 5 cohorts, and they followed them for decades. And over time, 1,153 cases of ALS eventually emerged. And again, diets were being assessed along the way, so it wasn't dependent on someone's memory of something 20 years ago. And it looks like diets that had a high carotenoid content were associated with a 25% lower risk of developing ALS. So beta-carotene, diets high in beta-carotene, 15% lower risk. We didn't get a dose cutoff, but we did get a dose range. So in women, it was 2 milligrams per day up to almost 4. And in men, it was 2.7 milligrams per day, all the way up to 4 milligrams per day. But even more interesting to me is the lutein. So diets with a high lutein content were associated with a 21% lower risk. Again, we didn't get specific dose cutoffs, we didn't get ranges, but I can tell you again from an ALSUntangled review that many studies, when they're studying lutein, they use a dose of 6 milligrams per day. Is there any risk to carotenoids? Not really. Again, when they're consumed in moderation through food, they're usually pretty safe. So if you have a tendency toward lung cancer, like if you smoke a lot, there are some studies suggesting that these might increase your chances of getting lung cancer. If you take too much beta-carotene, you can turn orange, something which is called carotenodermia. And there are certain medications that you might not want to take a carotenoid with. And so when it comes to beta-carotene, there's a couple of cholesterol-lowering medicines which interact. There's a weight loss drug called orlistat, which I don't think is used that much anymore. Mineral oil can interact. Alcohol can interact. Statins can interact. And lutein and beta-carotene can interact together. So now we'll turn our attention to the one supplement that I ran into with ALSUntangled that might alter someone's risk for getting ALS, and that's vitamin E. So vitamin E is a fat-soluble essential micronutrient. Again, we don't make it. We have to get it from our diets. It mainly comes from plants. Its chemical name is alpha-tocopherol. It also has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory actions. There's a case control study, again, suggesting that diets with more vitamin E might have a lower risk of ALS. But interestingly, there are 3 other case control studies that don't show that same benefit. There are 3 prospective cohort studies that suggest that vitamin E might reduce someone's risk. So again, here's one from the American Cancer Society called the Prevention Cohort 2. 957,000 participants followed for 17 years, of which 525 eventually developed ALS. And vitamin use along the way was assessed by questionnaires. And in this study, those who reported regular vitamin E use, at least 15 days a month, if you used it for less than 10 years, the ALS risk was reduced by 41%. And if you used it for at least 10 years, the risk was reduced by 62%. Strangely, the dose of vitamin E that was taken was not specified. Here's another cohort study. In fact, this is another one of those ones that pool multiple cohorts. Again, over 1 million participants here, followed for decades. Over 800 eventually developed ALS. Vitamin use assessed along the way by questionnaires. And again, we see that those reporting regular vitamin use for 2 to 4 years, they had their ALS reduced by about 23%. And those with regular use for at least 5 years had their ALS risk reduced by 36%. In females, but not males, those using higher doses, more than 400 international units per day, had their ALS risk reduced by 21%. And then last but not least, we have this cohort. So this is a group of male smokers from Finland. There were almost 30,000 of them. Their age ranged from 50 to 69. They were followed for an average of 17 years, and 50 of them developed ALS. And what's nice about this study is it divided the population into the blood level of vitamin E or alpha tocopherol. And so participants with a higher level, above 11.6 milligrams per liter, their ALS risk was reduced by 44%. There are some risks to vitamin E. It is a fat-soluble vitamin. And so you do have to, again, watch out for a bleeding risk. So someone who has a bleeding disorder or takes medicine to thin their blood, this probably would not be a good medicine for them. And again, oddly, if you're at an increased risk of prostate cancer, this might exacerbate that. Last but not least, there is one prescription medicine that we've run into with ALS Untangled that's relevant to today's talk, and that is tamoxifen. And I will not try to pronounce that chemical name, but this is an oral estrogen receptor modulator. It's FDA approved for the treatment of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. It's sold under a lot of brand names, but it does have multiple mechanisms that could be relevant to ALS: antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and neuroprotective properties. So there's only one study here. It's a nested case control study, and it's people who are in the Medicare database. So within that database, they pulled out 10,450 people who eventually got diagnosed with ALS. And for each person with ALS, they get 10 matched controls, again, matched in terms of age range and demographics. So 104,000 controls. And they looked across all medications. Medications were assessed by claims data, so that's pretty accurate. Anytime that somebody filled a prescription in a pharmacy, it was in this database. And here we see that tamoxifen use was associated with a 40% lower risk of ALS. There weren't any dosages given, but in the ALS trials that we reviewed for ALS Untangled, most of them used either 40 or 80 milligrams a day. There are some risks. So a fair number of people who take tamoxifen will develop hot flashes, 24% in the ALS trials that we reviewed with ALS Untangled. Tamoxifen actually is carcinogenic. It causes cancer in animals. And in patients who take it for breast cancer, there is a slightly increased risk of developing other cancers when people are followed for years. Now, the question is really, is that because these people had cancer in the first place, that they were more likely to get another cancer, or is that really because of the tamoxifen? And again, we see that there can be some risks as far as clotting. So it may be something that increases your risk of getting a blood clot, like a deep vein thrombosis or a pulmonary embolism or a stroke. So now we come to this slide. I don't know for sure what I would do if I had ALS or if I had a gene that might cause ALS someday. Again, I think about this a lot, and I think the only way you know is if you're actually there. But this is what I think I would do if you asked me today. So I would follow some of the suggestions from the guidance document that Benatar and others wrote. I would try to avoid smoking and head injuries. I would be under the care of an ALS expert to get monitored, and I would probably go twice a year. And I might ask for a sooner appointment if I started having concerning symptoms like cramps or twitching or fatigue. I do think I probably would add some things into my life right away that seemed easy, reasonably safe and inexpensive. So I would try to make sure that my diet contained at least 1.93 grams per deciliter of alpha linoleic acid, at least 4,000 milligrams per day of beta carotene, and at least 6 milligrams per day of lutein. And I probably would take vitamin E at a dose between 800 and 1,000 international units daily. And the nice thing there is we know what level we're shooting for. So every 6 months, I would ask for a vitamin E level, and I would try to keep it between 12 and 17. 17 is where you start to worry about toxicity. I would also ask for a neurofilament light chain level every 6 months. And if it started to increase above normal, then I probably would start tamoxifen at a low dose. And if after a month I was tolerating it, I would bump it up to 40 milligrams twice a day. And then finally, if I started to develop really clear symptoms or signs of ALS, like unexplained muscle atrophy or weakness or hyperreflexia or denervation or reinnervation on an EMG, I would start the ALS treatments that I have the most confidence in. So riluzole and high-dose intramuscular methylcobalamin. And if my mutation was SOD1, I would start tofersen. The other thing that I think is really, really important, and this one to me is absolutely critical, is if I was in this group with an elevated risk of genetic ALS, I would join that Prevent All ALS study, because I think that we need to get smarter about preventing ALS. And the only way that we're going to get there is by studying more people. And so we really need to understand that period that I talked about in the beginning before the axons start to die. What is happening in the body? Is there some sort of biomarker that tells us that inflammation or oxidative stress or mitochondrial dysfunction is happening? And if so, we might be able to intervene and even keep the axons from deteriorating. So I promised you I would make one suggestion for your next pre-symptomatic ALS workshop and your next guidance document. And that is that somebody ought to be assigned to doing a thorough literature review on this topic of ALS prevention. So I did not do a thorough literature review to prepare this talk for you today. What I did is mention things that I bumped into with ALS Untangled. A thorough literature review is going to take a lot of person hours, many more than I had to prepare this talk. I just typed in ALS prevention into a database called PubMed, where all peer-reviewed articles get put. And there's over 4,000 hits. Now, not every one of these papers is something that a person with pre-symptomatic ALS could do, but I suspect there's a lot more ideas out there that should be talked about in the next guidance. So I'll end here by just thanking you, people living with ALS. I mean, there's no way I would still be here 25 years in if it weren't for you. I mean, you inspired me to keep going. There definitely have been days when I was close to quitting, but it was always a person living with ALS who did something that inspired me to keep going. And I'll add, people living with an elevated risk of genetic ALS to this equation too. And I want to thank my colleagues who work with me on ALS Untangled, and of course, my Duke ALS team for helping me build this great foundation of patient care upon which all this research is built. So I'm going to stop my share, and then I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bedlack. And if you have not checked out ALS Untangled yet, I really encourage you all to check it out. One of the things that I deeply appreciate is that you list the exact supplement with the exact dose and you spell it all out. There is no hidden information, so that you're empowering patients and families to participate on these trials on their own. There's no gatekeeping. And I think that's really fabulous. I will also throw out a disclaimer. Nothing I say is meant to be taken as medical advice, but this is my field in multiple capacities. So before you hop out and pick up vitamin E up off the shelf, I would encourage all of you to do your due diligence and making sure that it's a reputable supplement company that has a good product. The supplement industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. A lot of things are adulterated, and things that you pick up on Amazon are often fake. And same thing for like GNC. So just be really cautious with supplements. If you're looking to partner with somebody, please find someone who's knowledgeable about supplements and can help guide you through that. We're also happy to see you at Temple in our genetic carrier clinic, our clinic of compassion with Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson and myself. So thank you for encouraging people to get preventative checks and to have things like neurofilament light chain monitored. These are care paradigms that we as a group feel deeply about. And I have started to explain it like, hey, you go for your physical, go for your neurology check, work with your neurologist in an ALS center to really find out like what makes sense for you and where you're at in your health and in your journey. More to come on that, both in upcoming guidance and at our symposium that's coming out. So enough from me, but let's pop over to some of our questions. So there were some that were emailed ahead of time, and let me just pull those up here. So first question is asking about if you are a child of someone who had sporadic ALS, does it make sense to have regular genetic screening as new genetic information becomes available, which could help with early intervention?
It's a great question. I mean, the problem is, first off, I think the risk of having an ALS causing gene, if there's only one other person in the family, is pretty low. I mean, if you understand that going in and you understand some of the downsides that can come from learning that you do have a gene, well, then I think you're an adult of sound mind. It's totally fine to have that, but just make sure that you understand that whole equation. Like, I think it's pretty clear that a person who has ALS should get genetic testing nowadays. It's still a little bit murky in my mind about a person who comes from a family where there are multiple people with ALS. It probably makes more sense than a person who comes from a family where there's only one case of ALS. Because again, I think the risk of having a gene is incredibly low. But again, if you understand that and you understand the downsides and you want to do it, I mean, I think as long as you're going in with your eyes wide open, I don't think I would do that. If I had it's just one person in my family with ALS, I don't think I would get a genetic test.
Oops, sorry. As far as repeat testing go, a lot of places do hold your information and will repeat the testing as new genes are identified in a lot of the observational studies. Here's another question that was emailed in, and I personally am very interested in your thoughts on rapamycin.
Yeah. So, I mean, rapamycin belongs to a group of medicines called TOR inhibitors. So again, I don't think that we really have any good evidence that it's a good treatment for ALS or that it can prevent the onset of ALS in people. We certainly didn't bump into that with any of our ALSUntangled articles. So I would be surprised if there was any large, cohort study where 1 million people were followed and they were asked about the use of that medicine, because it's a very unusual medicine for someone to be on. So it wouldn't be on my own personal list right now. I mean, certainly if somebody wants to do a trial, that makes sense, but it wouldn't be on my own personal list of things that I would want to try right now if I had this, a gene and I was at an elevated risk of genetic ALS.
Yeah, very good. I'll hop over to the chat now, so we're hitting people who are in this call. Thoughts on men with tamoxifen?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's reasonable. So that study wasn't just women. I mean, there were men can get breast cancer too. So although it was predominantly women, there were some men in that database. And so, I mean, if you can put up with the symptoms of hot flashes, then I think it's a reasonable thing to try. Certainly in the trials that were done mainly by Ben Brooks in people with ALS, the drug was not restricted to just females. And there were 3 trials and all of them showed some evidence of benefit. That's why it's on my current list of 8 most promising alternative and off-label treatments that I talk about in a Niels webinar that I gave a few months ago.
Very good. This is a great question in the chat too. High dose methylcobalamin injections that are affordable, can you just swap out for oral?
Yeah, the answer is we don't know, and probably not. So, the group in Japan that has been studying this the longest, their theory was that we really need to knock down the levels of something called homocysteine, and it's not that easy to do with oral medication. So, I think that you probably will eventually see high dose injectable methylcobalamin get FDA approved for ALS. I understand that there's a company behind it now that has gotten approval in Japan. So I think it's just a matter of getting it in front of the FDA. But given its safety profile and given the strength of the data from Japan for people who are in the first 1 year of symptoms, I think it's probably going to get FDA approved in the next couple of years. Again, for ALS, not to try to prevent ALS.
Great. And I would just throw some caution out there with extrapolating substances that are used with one route with a different delivery method. A lot of things are destroyed in stomach acid, so you often can't translate intravenous or IM injections over into oral or topical. So just some caution there. If I'm not answering your question, it's not because it's not a good question, but because I'm really trying to zero in on today's topic. More prevention. So here's a great one. Any updates that you know about, and I'm going to loop another question there with metformin, Prime C, or the GLP-GIPs like semaglutide or tirzepatide?
Yeah. So here's what I would say about semaglutide. Start with the one that I think is the easiest. So unless there's no other option for a person's diabetes, that would be one that I would tend to shy away from. And the reason is there's a case report, but there's also like a case control study suggesting that that's probably not a good medicine for people with ALS, that progression may accelerate on that type of medicine. And we don't know why. It could be the weight loss. It could be the tightness of the glycemic control. And I say that because we have some evidence in ALS that high glycemic index diets are associated with slower progression. So if I had ALS, or if I was at an elevated risk of genetic ALS, I personally would probably shy away from those, even though the data is not quite as clear as what I showed you today, which was kind of murky. So we've got a long way to go on that, but there's a lot of other ways to control blood sugar. And then when it comes to, you asked about metformin, I think it's a fascinating study. I believe we're going to get some results this fall, either at the Niels meeting or at the International Symposium on ALS. So Niels is in October, International Symposium's in December. By my calculations, that study should be finished and the data should be ready to present by then, but we'll see. But no, there hasn't been anything publicly released on that.
And there was another question about Prime C, but specific to Prime C, I'd love to hear your thoughts on prevention.
Yeah. So I have to say, I'm not a huge fan right now of that. I hope my mind gets changed by the next trial. I'm a little bit mystified by the buzz around it. Prime C is 2 ingredients: celecoxib, which is Celebrex, which we already tried in ALS. It didn't do any better than placebo. And ciprofloxacin is an antibiotic, but that particular antibiotic, if you open up the package insert, it has a big black box warning from the FDA that says, don't give this to people with a neuromuscular disease. So to me, it's an odd combination. I know those 2 things do things to the body that you would think would be promising in ALS, but there are lots of other things do the same stuff. And so it seems to me, if it were me, I would have picked 2 other things that accomplish those mechanisms. As far as the phase 2 data, what's been presented publicly, I personally, it doesn't look any better to me than what I saw with AMX 0035. And we all know what happened there. We had a phase 2 study that looked promising and it got approved. And then, the approval, I think, was in part because the owners of the drug promised that they would finish their phase 3 study. So it wasn't technically a conditional approval, which I recently learned we don't actually have in this country. We should, but there was a promise made, and the promise was fulfilled. About a year and a half after it was approved, the phase 3 study was completed. It clearly showed no benefit at all. And so the owners of the drug pulled it from the market. So, I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I think there's enough there in the phase 2 study to warrant another study. But me personally, I don't recommend that one to my patients. It wouldn't be something I would be interested in taking either for ALS or for the prevention of ALS.
Yeah, as someone who's written prescriptions for Cipro many years ago, when that big black box fires up on your screen, I was surprised too when it was coming out into trials, because we had the fear of God drilled into us over fluoroquinolones. So I thought that was kind of strange too. Um, a great question that we've been tossing around on the monitoring side is, do you think it might be possible to monitor neurofilaments in response to interventions to try and get an idea of, is what we're doing working?
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced that we can do that in groups of patients. I think that's where the whole field is now. We feel like if we're going to do short trials, like 4 to 6 month trials, which are the kind of trials I like, because I don't like to just keep people on things unless it's clear that it's helping, then neurofilament is where we need to focus. Like that's not enough time to see clear clinical benefits, 4 to 6 months. But I mean, if you think about what happened with tofersen, if tofersen was being developed 10 years ago, it would be in the trash right now. Like what I consider to be the first home run in the history of ALS would be in the trash. And the reason is because at 6 months, which was the planned duration of the blinded phase of the study, there were no significant clinical benefits. But the reason why people kept looking at it is because the mechanism of action was so strong. We knew that it drastically knocked down mutant SOD1 protein, but even more so because it knocked neurofilament down in the whole group more than anything that we'd ever seen. And so there was such a strong feeling that predicted later clinical benefit that they decided to give it what's called an accelerated approval, which is the first accelerated approval in the history of ALS. That's how much confidence they had in that biomarker. And I would say they were right. The data that we now have on people who take that for a long time show that it's a home run. More than 50% of people who've been on it for 2 years or more have stopped progressing, and 25% are significantly stronger than they were 2 years ago. So that's what I call a home run. Now, getting back to your question, I'm not yet convinced that we can use neurofilament in an individual patient to monitor. So all the time I see fluctuations in this, like more and more patients ask for it. I'm happy to do it. The problem is, like, let's say neurofilament goes down by 5 to 10% over 4 to 6 months. What does that mean? Like, there's never been a study that says that predicts clinical benefit. If it drops by 50% or more, then I would really be excited. But a small change is something that it seems like I'm seeing fairly commonly. And I just don't know that we have a level that we can say we're confident predicts later benefit. So I'm still, for me, when I have patients that self-experiment, and almost all of my patients do, I've got over 500 patients self-experimenting with something right now as we speak. I'm still trying to convince them to stay on it for 6 months and see what's the slope of the ALS FRSR score. Does it seem like it's flattening? And if so, maybe we'll keep it going for a few more months and see if it starts to reverse. That's really what I'm looking for, something that's dramatic and unusual in the natural history of the disease.
Yeah, and again, there's a ton of great questions pouring in, a lot of things related to environment, which could be a multi-day webinar. So I'm going to pick one last question before we wrap up. And we've talked a little bit about high glycemic. We've talked about healthy fats. We've talked about different dietary things. Is there a specific diet that you think would be helpful, like keto versus Mediterranean?
Yeah, I don't think I would think about the diet for someone who's at an elevated risk of genetic ALS in those broad strokes. Like, I don't think the diets you mentioned really have any evidence that they would delay or prevent a person from getting ALS. But in that one slide where I listed the kind of things that I would do, those are like very specific changes to the diet, where like you could sit down with a nutritionist and you could say, hey, I want to get my ALA content in my diet to be this. I want to get my carotenoid content in my diet to be this. I want to get my vitamin E level to be this. That's all very specific things that can be changed in a person's diet where there's at least some evidence that it might delay or prevent ALS.
Yeah, great answer. And I think, this is where really one-on-one care comes into play. My great grandfather who had ALS died of a heart attack. So we still need to take care of all these other aspects of our life. We need healthy hearts, we need healthy bodies. We often get really focused in on our neuro risk, but we still have this whole other body to think about. Again, tons of great questions in here. I think what this is showing me is we can certainly have this conversation again. Thank you to everyone on the call today. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. You're always so sharing of your time and expertise, and it is very much appreciated. Again, if you haven't checked out ALS Untangled and that work, it is really incredible. It's so very clearly laid out. I really enjoy hopping on there and seeing what things are in the pipeline. You can add things too that you want looked into. So a couple of the questions were about very specific supplements or chemicals. Pop those in there and see if you can get an ALS Untangled on that. Certainly open to anybody reaching out to the organization. And any closing thoughts, Dr. Bedlack?
No, I would just say I think it's an incredibly exciting time. Like I've been traveling like crazy the past few weeks, and part of it is just to try to convince people to make noise about holding on to our research funding. And I'm trying to get people to kind of change the narrative when they talk to their members of Congress. Like I've been advocating, to my leaders in the government for 25 years for research funding. And for most of the time, it's been, let's all go in there and let's tell people like what a sad, frustrating disease this is and how few treatments we have. And I think that worked pretty well for a while. We got a lot of funding with that story, but I think this administration is different. And I think we have to kind of ask ourselves like what resonates with them. And the story that I would tell now is we've got a success. We've got an American success story, which is tofersen. We took the research funding that people gave us and we developed a drug that's the first home run in 150 years of ALS research. We can stop and in some cases reverse one form of ALS with this drug. Isn't that amazing? The whole world is looking to us and applauding. There was a standing ovation at a meeting in another country when this was presented by an American author. So what an incredible American success story that the whole country can be proud of. Now is not the time to pull back from this. Like we're going to understand the other 99% of ALS subtypes, and we're going to have more home runs if we can just keep our resources. Like we've shown you that we can do this. So don't take it away now. So that's a different narrative to me, and it hopefully will resonate with this administration.
I certainly hope so as well. I want to keep you and everybody who's working so hard in this community funded. We have to keep pushing forward, and together as a community, I know we can make this happen. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack, and I hope to see you all in June at the summit. Bye.
Bye, everyone.